you remember the rest of the story? Remember how the children of Israel come down there, and you know what's happened, and now the father's died. And so Genesis 50:15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. Okay, so can we settle without question the reality that what they did in selling Joseph into slavery was sin? It was wrong. The answer is yes, clearly. Clearly. And Joseph wept when the messenger spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. Not your brothers. We are your servants. And so all through this, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. See, all of this is separating themselves from Joseph. They're not saying, oh, brother, 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 because they know they pretty well burned that bridge a long time ago. So they come, fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? For am I in the place of God? May I suggest that Joseph understood something that a lot of Christians don't understand? That Joseph understood there's God's place and then there's the creature's place. And only God can be in God's place. And we need to leave God in God's place. And we will mess everything up big time when we try to take God's place. We ain't big enough. We ain't smart enough. We shouldn't even want to be there. Am I in God's place? That has to be understood before the verse 20 will be understood. That the only way that you will be able to see the fullness of what Genesis 50:20 means. And Genesis 50:20 is words of wisdom that come from Joseph, who suffered for decades before he could come to understand. The immature, proud little kid who had his kuji ripped off of him before being sent to Egypt had changed massively in the years afterwards. And he had suffered. And it was suffering that gave him the maturity to recognize that we can never be in God's place. God has a place that we never belong. He is sovereign. He is accomplishing his purpose. And if you don't start there, if you put man's philosophy, if you put human autonomy in God's place, you're not going to understand Genesis 50:20. You're not going to. Am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me. You intended against me ra'ah, evil. He doesn't use some strange word that could be translated many different ways. Ra'ah means evil. And you intended it. It was the intention of your heart, and it was aimed against me. It wasn't just, you experienced this strange, impersonal feeling of evil, and I got... No, it was, you intended evil against me. That's what the first four words, not including any antecedents, you intended evil against me. God, then using the same verb, intended, and I'm looking over the Greek Septuagint as well, both using bulimai. God intended, meant it for good, not for me. For me is not repeated. Meant it for good in order to bring about this day, literally, this present result, and to preserve Rab. Many people, chai, alive. To preserve the lives of many people. So, let's look at what is not parallel between the two first. What is not parallel is, as one would expect, the brothers' intentions very narrow. Focus solely upon Joseph. You meant evil against me. God meant it, which was their act of evil. There's no question. It's the same thing. God meant it for good. But it's not just for my good. He meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. And yes, that meant their family and flocks and servants and all the rest of that stuff. But we know that many people in Egypt had been preserved alive because of the interpretation of the dreams, the famine, storehouses, you know the rest of the story. So there is not an absolute parallel because God's intention is bigger, broader, and better. But what is unquestionably parallel, the only reason that the Hebrew looks different is because when you write Hebrew, you use different forms depending upon the form of the verb, whether it's singular, plural, you can have direct objects, etc., etc. And so you meant evil, that's the brothers, but God's singular, but it's the same verb. You intended, you meant, and there's only one object, it, the act of evil. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. You have absolute parallel. You have one act. It was an evil act, but it was intended by God. I don't know how you can get around this. Well, you're going to hear one way of trying to get around it in a moment. But you have one act. And in God's ordering of his universe, the judgment for that act is based upon the intentionality of the will. They meant it for evil. God meant it for good. That was how God chose to get Joseph into a place to save many people alive, and that is good. The act itself on the part of the brothers was evil. If you have to flatten that out to where both of those statements cannot be true, you will never, ever be able to handle the text of Scripture in a meaningful fashion. You won't. You won't. So here is Leighton Flowers on Genesis 50:20.
Well, sure. I'd back up a little bit and look at the context of the text, because the original intent of the brothers was not to sell the brother into slavery. If you look through the narrative, their original intent was murderous. They wanted to kill him because of pride. They were jealous. Well, where does pride originate? Where does that come from? 1 John 2:16 says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. So whatever we conclude here, we cannot go against what Scripture teaches us and conclude that some eternal divine decree is the cause or the origin of these brothers' pride.
Okay, so the first thing that is stated is, whatever this is saying, it can't be what he says it says. So my interpretation is the origin of pride is from the world, therefore it can't come from God, and therefore there is no divine decree. Do we recognize eisegesis when we see it? Do we recognize someone who, looking at the text, is going, I have overriding commitments that will not allow me to hear what this text is saying? And since this text specifically presents the one divine truth that is the kryptonite to my tradition, and that is compatibilism. Because if compatibilism is true, if there can be one event that is sinful on the part of one and good on the part of the other, as Genesis 50:20 says, then the entire argumentation that he utilizes collapses. It's done.
We have to come to a better conclusion than to impugn, I think, again, unintentionally, I think Chris's view impugns the character of God in that way.
So, the text says, I know, you keep going back to the text. The text says there's one event, the brothers meant it for evil, God meant it for good. Oh, you don't want to impugn God's character in that way. I'm not impugning God's character. God is big enough to intend good through man's evil. That's what the cross is about. That's what Isaiah 10 is about. That's what Genesis 50 is about. Leighton just doesn't believe those because he has an overarching concept that he doesn't derive from Scripture, but he places on top of Scripture. So do we get a positive exegesis? Let's find out.
And so what we would say, I'll give an analogy. For example, police officers.
We get an analogy. We don't get exegesis. We get an analogy. Because exegesis is not supportive of our position. But an analogy, we can try to come up with a story that will keep people from recognizing that we're not actually dealing with the text. Because we have a different ultimate authority.
A sting operation where they know of notorious drug dealers in the area. They know their intention. They know that they're evil. And they don't cause, but they use the evil intention of criminals in order to bring about the selling of drugs at a particular time on Thursday at 2 o'clock in the warehouse so as to catch all the drug dealers in one place in a sting operation. So the police officers meant that selling of drugs, an evil crime, for a good reason, while the criminals meant it for a bad reason. So the same crime, the same act is being meant by both the police officers and the criminals. One is being meant for an evil purpose, for selfish gain. The other is being meant for a good purpose. And in the same way, in this scenario, obviously God meant what the brothers did for a good purpose, for redemption. So God's not redeeming his own determinations here. He's redeeming the brothers' bad determinations. He's bringing a good...
So notice, he's redeeming their bad determinations. He did not determine the same act. He's redeeming their bad determinations. That's not what the text says. We've already demonstrated that. So he's changing the text in light of his analogy, in light of his overriding tradition. This is how tradition substantiates itself. It can't be derived from exegesis. This is eisegesis. This is Leighton Flowers eisegeting Genesis 50 in light of his tradition.
From the bad, he's not causing the bad so as to just redeem his own determination.
Chris, interesting analogy there as well with the same crime being meant for different purposes and so on. What's your take on that?
So, went through that before, but now, especially in light of what we're hearing, what you can see is the a priori force that this tradition has. So even when you're looking at one of the clearest texts in all of Scripture that gives you will of man, will of God, one act, you can't accept it. You just simply can't accept it.